I joked that our baby looks like my ex, and my husband walked out without saying a word. That was 6 hours ago, and he's not answering his phone. I thought it was just a harmless joke, but the silence is making me realize I might have said something unforgivable. It was Sunday morning, and both Michael and I were exhausted from another sleepless night with baby Sophia. That's when it happened. Sophia made this particular expression, her eyebrows scrunched together and her mouth twisted in a way that reminded me so powerfully of someone else that the words were out of my mouth before I could stop them. I laughed and joked that she looks just like my ex when she makes that face. The words hung in the air like a poison cloud. Michael's hand froze on the bottle, and I watched the color drain from his face as he processed what I'd just said. The easy intimacy of the moment shattered instantly, replaced by something cold and terrible. Michael didn't say anything. He just sat there, staring at me with an expression I couldn't read. Sophia began to fuss, sensing the tension in the room the way babies do, but Michael mechanically continued feeding her, while his eyes remained fixed on me with that horrible blank stare. I tried to backtrack immediately, laughing nervously and explaining that it was just a funny expression, that babies make all sorts of faces, that I didn't mean anything by it. But the words sounded hollow even to me, and Michael's face didn't change. He finished feeding Sophia in complete silence, burped her with the same mechanical precision, and placed her gently in her crib. Then he walked past me without saying a word, grabbed his keys from the kitchen counter and left. The front door didn't slam. It closed with a quiet finality that was somehow worse than anger would have been. I stood in the nursery with Sophia beginning to cry, understanding with growing horror that I'd just said something that couldn't be taken back. I've left 12 voicemails, each one more desperate than the last, trying to explain that it was just a thoughtless comment, that I didn't mean anything by it. But with each passing hour, the silence feels more ominous. I've been alone with Sophia all day, and the routine that we usually shared is falling apart without Michael here. He's the one who usually handles the afternoon feeding while I shower, who takes over baby duty when I'm overwhelmed. Without him, I'm struggling to maintain the careful schedule we'd established, and Sophia can sense my stress. My mother came by around noon after I called her in tears, and her reaction made everything worse. She asked what exactly I'd said to Michael, and when I told her, she looked at me like I'd lost my mind. She wanted to know why I would say something like that, what I was thinking, whether I understood how that would sound to a new father. I tried to explain that it was just an observation, that babies sometimes look like random people, that I'd seen articles about how newborns can resemble anyone. But even as I said it, I knew how weak it sounded. My mother's expression told me everything I needed to know about how inappropriate my comment had been. She stayed for a few hours to help with Sophia, but I could see the judgment in her eyes. Before she left, she suggested that maybe I should think about why I'd said what I said, whether there was something I needed to examine about my feelings regarding my past relationship. Her implication was clear, and it made me feel sick. By evening, I was frantic. I'd called Michael's work buddy Tom, who said Michael had called in sick and mentioned needing some time to think. I'd tried his brother Dave, who answered but said he hadn't heard from Michael. I'd even called his mother, but she didn't pick up, which felt significant and terrifying. The worst part was being alone with my thoughts and the growing realization of what my joke had implied. I'd compared our daughter to another man, and in doing so, I'd planted a seed of doubt that I couldn't take back. Even if I hadn't meant it that way, even if it was just a thoughtless comment, I could see how it would sound to Michael. Let me explain how we got to this point, how a relationship that had seemed so solid could be shattered by one careless sentence. My name is Emma. I'm 26 years old, and I met Michael 3 years ago at a mutual friend's party. I'd been single for about 6 months at that point, having ended a 2-year relationship with my ex that had been intense, but ultimately destructive. He was the kind of guy who was exciting and unpredictable, but also unreliable and emotionally unavailable. Michael was different from anyone I'd ever dated. He was steady, kind, and genuinely interested in building something real. He worked construction, had his own small crew, and talked about the future with a confidence that my ex had never possessed. Where my previous relationship had been all passion and drama, Michael was calm and consistent. In the early days of our relationship, Michael had asked about my past relationships, and I'd been honest about my ex. I'd told him it had been serious, but that it had ended because he wasn't ready for commitment. Michael had seemed secure enough to handle the information, and we'd moved forward without it being an issue. But I'd noticed small signs of insecurity over the years. Michael would sometimes ask questions about my ex when we'd run into mutual friends who knew about my past. He'd wonder aloud whether I missed the excitement of that relationship, whether I found our stable life boring in comparison. I'd always reassured him that what we had was so much better, that I'd chosen him for all the right reasons. When I got pregnant 18 months ago, Michael was overjoyed. He immediately started planning for our future, talking about converting the spare room into a nursery, researching the best schools in our area, making lists of everything we'd need. His excitement was infectious, and I fell in love with him all over again watching him prepare to be a father. The pregnancy was difficult from the start. I had severe morning sickness that lasted well into the second trimester, and complications that required bed rest during the final month. Michael was incredible throughout everything, taking time off work to care for me, handling all the household responsibilities, never complaining about the extra burden. When Sophia was born 3 months ago, it was after an emergency C-section that left me weak and struggling with recovery. Michael stepped up completely, handling most of the night feedings, changing diapers, doing everything he could to help me heal. He was a natural father, patient and gentle with Sophia in ways that made me love him even more. But the sleepless nights and stress of new parenthood had taken their toll on both of us. We were both exhausted, surviving on fragments of sleep and running on adrenaline. Our conversations had become focused on logistics, feeding schedules, diaper changes, pediatrician appointments. The deep connection we'd always shared had been temporarily buried under the demands of caring for a newborn. I'd been struggling with what I now realize was probably postpartum depression, though I hadn't acknowledged it at the time. I felt isolated and overwhelmed, especially during the long days when Michael was at work and I was alone with Sophia. I'd started having strange thoughts, comparing my current life to how things had been before, sometimes wondering if I'd made the right choices. The truth was, I had noticed that Sophia looked like my ex. She had his dark hair and his unusually green eyes, features that were nothing like Michael's blonde hair and blue eyes. But I'd kept that observation to myself, understanding instinctively that it was something I should never voice. Michael had often commented on how Sophia had my eyes, and I'd never corrected him. I'd let him believe what he wanted to believe because it seemed kinder than pointing out the resemblance to someone else. But in my exhausted state that Sunday morning, my filter had failed me completely. Now, sitting in our quiet apartment with Sophia sleeping and Michael gone, I was beginning to understand the full scope of what I'd done. It wasn't just a thoughtless comment. It was a betrayal of trust that cut to the heart of Michael's deepest insecurities. I'd compared our daughter to another man, and in doing so, I'd implied something that I knew would destroy him. The next morning, Michael still hadn't come home. I'd barely slept, checking my phone constantly for any sign of communication. Sophia had been fussy all night, perhaps sensing the tension, and I'd struggled through the feeding schedule alone. Everything felt wrong without Michael there. I decided to drive to his brother's house, thinking maybe I could talk to him face to face and explain what I'd meant. But when I arrived, no one answered the door, even though I could see Michael's truck in the driveway. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, calling his phone and watching the house, but nothing happened. The silence felt deliberate and final. When I got home, there was a voicemail from Michael's boss asking if he was coming back to work. Michael had apparently called in sick for the rest of the week, saying he needed time to deal with a family emergency. The fact that he'd taken time off work to avoid me made the situation feel even more serious. By the third day, I was becoming desperate. I'd called everyone we knew, trying to find someone who'd heard from Michael. His friends were uncomfortable and evasive, clearly knowing more than they were saying. His family had stopped taking my calls entirely, which felt like a judgment on what I'd done. I found myself calling my ex, which felt like the most desperate and foolish thing I could do. I needed him to confirm that there had been no contact between us, that there was no possibility of what Michael might be thinking. My ex was confused and concerned, not understanding why I was calling him about my baby or my marriage. His reaction made me realize how insane the whole situation had become. Michael thought I'd had an affair. He thought my ex might be Sophia's father. My thoughtless joke had been interpreted as a confession, and now he was questioning everything about our relationship, our daughter, and our future. I tried to call him again, leaving voicemails that explained my realization, and begged him to come home so we could talk. I told him I understood what he was thinking, and that it wasn't true, that I'd never been unfaithful, that Sophia was definitely his daughter. But the calls went unanswered, and I began to wonder if he'd blocked my number. A week after Michael left, his sister Sarah finally called me. She was kind but distant, explaining that Michael was staying with them and that he wasn't ready to talk yet. When I asked what he'd told her, she was reluctant to share details, but eventually admitted that he was questioning whether Sophia was his biological daughter. The conversation with Sarah made me realize how deep the damage went. Michael hadn't just been hurt by my comment, he'd been fundamentally shaken in his trust in me. He was questioning not just that moment, but our entire relationship, wondering if I'd been lying to him about other things, if our whole life together was built on deception. Sarah suggested that maybe Michael needed time to process everything, that he was dealing with new father anxiety, and my comment had triggered his worst fears. She recommended that I give him space and maybe consider couples counseling when he was ready, but her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced that time would heal this wound. 2 weeks after Michael left, I received legal papers at my door. He was filing for legal separation and requesting a paternity test for Sophia. The official documents made everything feel final and terrifying. He wasn't just taking time to cool off, he was taking legal action to protect himself from what he saw as my deception. The paternity test request felt like the ultimate betrayal, even though I understood his reasoning. After 3 years together, after watching him love Sophia from the moment she was born, he was questioning whether she was even his daughter. My one stupid comment had unraveled everything we'd built together. When the results came back 2 weeks later, they confirmed what I'd known all along. Michael was definitely Sophia's father. I called him immediately with the news, thinking it would fix everything, that we could move past this terrible misunderstanding. But his response was more complicated than I'd expected. Michael agreed to meet me at a neutral location, a coffee shop near his brother's house, where we could talk without the emotional weight of our apartment. When I saw him, he looked exhausted and older somehow, like the stress of the past month had aged him years. He acknowledged the paternity results but said the real issue wasn't about Sophia's parentage. It was about trust. He explained that my comment had forced him to question everything about our relationship, to wonder if I'd been thinking about my ex throughout our time together, if I'd settled for him while still longing for someone else. I tried to explain that it had been a thoughtless comment, that I'd been exhausted and had spoken without thinking, but Michael said that was almost worse, that in an unguarded moment I'd revealed something that had been in my subconscious. He wondered if I'd been comparing him to my ex all along, if I'd been disappointed in what our relationship had become. The conversation was devastating because I could see his point. Even though I hadn't meant anything by the comment, it had come from somewhere. I had noticed the resemblance, had been thinking about my ex in some capacity, had made the comparison without considering how it would sound to Michael. In my exhausted state, I'd said something that revealed thoughts I hadn't even acknowledged to myself. Michael eventually agreed to come home, but things were different between us. He was distant and careful, treating me like someone he didn't entirely trust. He was still a devoted father to Sophia, but his interactions with me were formal and guarded. The easy intimacy we'd always shared was gone, replaced by politeness and caution. We tried counseling, but the sessions felt forced and artificial. Michael would acknowledge that he'd overreacted, that his insecurities had made him assume the worst. But he also said that my comment had revealed something about how I thought about our relationship, about whether I'd truly chosen him or settled for him. The trust we'd built over 3 years had been shattered by one careless sentence. Our intimate life completely disappeared. Michael moved into the guest room, claiming he needed better sleep to function at work, but I knew the real reason. He couldn't bear to be that close to me, couldn't trust himself to be vulnerable with someone who might be thinking about another man. The physical distance became a metaphor for the emotional chasm that had opened between us. Our friends and family noticed the change immediately. Michael's mother, who had always been warm and welcoming to me, became polite but distant. She'd come to visit Sophia, but would barely make eye contact with me, as if she blamed me for breaking her son's heart. Michael's brother Dave stopped including me in family gatherings, instead arranging to meet Michael separately or having him bring Sophia alone. My own family was equally affected. My mother, who had initially been critical of what I'd said, tried to be supportive as she watched our marriage deteriorate. But I could see the disappointment in her eyes, the way she'd shake her head when she thought I wasn't looking. She'd worked so hard to build a good relationship with Michael, and my careless comment had damaged that too. The financial consequences became apparent as Michael threw himself into work with an intensity that worried me. He was taking on extra projects, working longer hours, and spending more money than usual. All signs of someone trying to distract himself from problems at home. Our carefully planned budget began to strain as he made impulsive purchases and took on unnecessary expenses. I had to return to work after my maternity leave, but the stress of our situation made it almost impossible to focus. My boss noticed my distraction and declining performance, pulling me aside to ask if everything was okay at home. I couldn't explain what had happened without sounding like I'd done something terrible, so I just said we were adjusting to new parenthood and left it at that. The worst part was watching how our problems affected Sophia. Babies are incredibly sensitive to tension and stress, and she became increasingly fussy and difficult to soothe. Her sleep patterns, which had finally stabilized, became erratic again. She'd cry more when Michael and I were in the same room, as if she could sense the discord between us. The breaking point came 6 months after my comment, on what should have been a routine Saturday morning. Michael was feeding Sophia while I prepared her bath, and we were going through our usual careful choreography of shared parenting without emotional connection. Then Sophia made that same expression again, the one that had started everything, and I saw Michael's face change. He stared at her for a long moment, and I could see him remembering my words from months ago. The pain in his eyes was fresh, as if I'd just said it again. He finished feeding her mechanically, then looked at me with an expression of such profound sadness that my heart broke. That's when he said he couldn't do this anymore. He couldn't pretend we were working toward fixing something that was irreparably broken. He couldn't look at our daughter without hearing my comparison to another man. He couldn't share a home with someone he'd never fully trust again. The conversation was quiet and devastating. Michael explained that he'd tried to forgive me, had genuinely wanted to rebuild what we'd had, but the damage went too deep. Every time he looked at Sophia, he was reminded of my comment. Every time we interacted, he found himself analyzing my words for hidden meanings. The hypervigilance was exhausting him, and he realized it wasn't fair to any of us to continue living that way. I begged him to try harder, to give us more time, to consider what we'd be giving up. But Michael said he'd already given us months, and nothing had fundamentally changed. He still felt like he was living with a stranger who'd revealed something about herself that he couldn't reconcile with the person he'd thought he'd married. The divorce proceedings began 2 weeks later. Michael was fair but firm about the arrangements. He wanted joint custody of Sophia, with a schedule that would allow him to be actively involved in her life. He didn't seek spousal support, and he agreed to split our modest assets evenly. The legal process was civil but heartbreaking, reducing 3 years of love to a series of financial and custody arrangements. I moved out of our apartment and into a smaller place across town. The first night alone with Sophia in our new home, I cried until I had no tears left. The reality of what I'd lost hit me with full force. Not just Michael, but the future we'd planned together, the security of our family unit, the comfort of partnership in raising our daughter. The custody arrangement meant that Sophia would spend 3 days a week with Michael and 4 with me, alternating weekends. The transitions were painful, especially in the beginning when Sophia would cry when being passed from one parent to the other. She was too young to understand why her family had been split apart, but she could sense the fundamental change in her world. Michael found his own apartment closer to his work and threw himself into creating a space that would be welcoming for Sophia during his custody time. He bought all new baby furniture, decorated a nursery, and established his own routines for their time together. Watching him rebuild his life without me was a special kind of torture. The financial impact of maintaining 2 households was immediate and severe. What had been tight but manageable as a family budget became a constant struggle when split between 2 apartments. I had to take on freelance work in addition to my regular job, which meant less time with Sophia and more stress about childcare arrangements. Our families handled the divorce differently. Michael's family, who had always been warm and welcoming to me, became politely distant. They remained cordial during custody exchanges, but made it clear that they saw me as the one who had destroyed their family. My own family was supportive but disappointed, understanding that while my comment had been thoughtless, the consequences seemed disproportionate to the offense. The hardest part was explaining to friends and extended family why our marriage had ended. I couldn't tell people that I'd made a joke comparing our baby to my ex. It sounded so trivial and stupid that no one would understand how it had led to divorce. Instead, I gave vague explanations about growing apart after the baby, which felt like a lie even though it wasn't entirely untrue. Michael, meanwhile, seemed to be moving forward more successfully. I heard through mutual friends that he was dating someone new, a woman who worked in his industry and understood his world. The news hit me like a physical blow, even though I knew I had no right to be hurt. I'd been the one who'd destroyed our marriage, and he deserved to find happiness with someone who wouldn't betray his trust. I learned that some words can't be taken back, that some jokes cross lines that can't be uncrossed. In my exhausted state, I'd said something that revealed deeper truths about my thoughts and feelings, truths that I hadn't even acknowledged to myself. The damage wasn't just about the comment itself. It was about what the comment revealed about my state of mind and my feelings about our relationship. If this story resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Your support means everything to me. And I'm curious, what city are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below. Have you ever made a joke that went too far and damaged a relationship? Sometimes the things we say without thinking can have consequences we never imagined. Share your thoughts, and I'll see you in the next story.